Well, it's gratifying, and Matthew's certainly gratified to see so many people here this afternoon. This year is the 200th anniversary of Flinders' death and the 200th anniversary of the publication of his charts. Those events occurred within a day of each other. His charts were published on the 18th of July, and he died on the 19th of July. So July is the month for Flinders. And it's also the month in which a new statue of Flinders is to be erected in London at Australia House. And it shows Flinders over a map of Australia, doing some work on a map of Australia, and with Trim sitting, his cat, sitting very peacefully actually by his side. Now, in July 1804, Flinders is on Mauritius, and he wrote to Joseph Banks, not realising, of course, that he was going to be on Mauritius for another 6 years, and he's speaking as if he's in the middle of his career, or he's got a career to come, but of course, by this stage, his active career is in fact over. And he writes to Sir Joseph Banks, and he says, "I have too much ambition to rest in the unnoticed middle order of mankind. And since neither birth or fortune have favoured me, my actions shall speak to the world. In the regular service of the Navy, there are too many competitors for fame. I have therefore chosen a branch which, though less rewarded by rank and fortune, is yet little less in celebrity. In this the candidates are fewer, and in this, if adverse fortune does not oppose me, I will succeed." He's talking about charting, hydrography, that area of the Navy. "And although I cannot rival the immortalised name of Cook, yet if persevering industry joined to what ability I may possess can accomplish it, then will I secure the second place. If you, Sir Joseph, as my guardian genius, will but conduct me to the place of probation, the hitherto obscure name of Flinders may thus become a light by which even the illustrious character of Sir Joseph Banks may one day receive an additional ray of glory. As a satellite of Jove, I may reflect back splendour to the gracious primary, who by shining upon me shall give lustre to my yet unradiated name." Now, that little extract from his letter of the 12th of July 1804 tells us a lot about Matthew Flinders' character. I don't think this letter has actually been used before, but it does bring out his character. Of course, he's writing this when he's on Mauritius, and so he's talking about his ambition, and he says he doesn't have birth or fortune. That's an important consideration. He doesn't have a birth or fortune. He needs to make money. And that he's chosen hydrography because he will shine there. Well, of course, maybe he did, and maybe he didn't choose hydrography. Maybe it just worked out like that. I'm not sure that he deliberately chose hydrography, but he may have chosen to, certainly by the time he comes to circumnavigate Australia, he had chosen that area as the area in which to work. And notice he also says that, so he's interested in fame and fortune. He talks about rank and fortune, and celebrity, of course. And then he brings in the immortalised name of Cook. But notice he doesn't say he wants to be Cook's equal, much less Cook's superior. He wants to be in the second place, just under Cook. There's a certain humility there, a certain personal humility. He understood his abilities, and he certainly wanted to be famous, but he doesn't have any really highfalutin ideas that he's going to equal, much less surpass Cook. There is that humility there in him. And then, of course, he finishes the letter with a wonderful piece of flattery. And he could lay this flattery on, and he will flatter Banks in my talk. He does that again. And this wonderful image of that, he might actually be able to get a little light to the great Jove and radiate him even more. As he said, the hitherto obscure name of Flinders may thus become a light by which even the illustrious character Sir Joseph Banks may one day receive an additional ray of glory as a satellite of Jove. I may reflect back splendour to the gracious primary, who by shining upon me shall give lustre to my yet unradiated name. Now this tells us a lot about Flinders. Certainly his motivating factors, if you want to speak of this, were to be famous and to make money. Now the money bit is there, but he doesn't want to make money in order to make money. He doesn't want to be rich in order to be rich. He needs money because he doesn't have birth or fortune. He needs money to live, and it's always there and always a necessity. So he has to pay attention to it, but it's not his motivating factor in that sense. But he does want to be famous, as he talks about the name Flinders hasn't been famous yet. He wants to be famous. We need to remember that with him, that he had this ambition to be famous and to do the finest quality work possible. He had a high professional standard of the work he wanted to do. And in a way, the map of Australia that we know so well is his testimony, because not only did he give us the map of Australia, draw it for the first time. So he, of course, first charted Tasmania, proved it to be an island. And he charted the north and the south coasts, proving that the whole continent was one. He gave us our map. You'll see there, general chart of Terra Australis or Australia. When he came to publish this chart, he was not allowed to call it Australia because it was too newfangled a name. They wanted to use the old Terra Australis because it was a bit of a commercial consideration. That's what people knew, and that would sell the maps. And but he was able to put it in, or Australia. On his original hand-drawn map, he puts Australia. He puts Australia first. And so he gives us our name. And as when this map came to Sydney in 1817, this published map, Macquarie saw the word Australia on the map and said, yes, that will be the name of this place, and started using it officially. So he gave us our map, he gave us our name, but also he named more things, I think, than anybody else around Australia. And some of these are the big names: Cape Leeuwin, Great Australian Bight, the first time Australian was used in a geographical term. He probably had some input into Bass Strait. The Great Barrier Reef is his, Spencer Gulf is his, St Vincent's Gulf is his. But then all around Australia, there's many, many other places. But once again, thinking of his humility, nothing was named after himself. He named nothing after himself. But of course now on the map, there's loads of Flinders. There's Flinders Rivers, Flinders Mountains, not to mention, Flinders Highway and Flinders University and all the modern things. So that the map is actually saturated with the name Flinders and with things that Flinders named in a way that no other national map is so much the work of one man. So this remains his memorial, and this is bicentennial year, I feel. And here he is when he was to set out on that circumnavigation of Australia in 1801. This was a miniature created at the time, as was customary, and he'd leave this with his wife. Sometimes the wife would have an image of herself and he'd take that with him. But if that was the case, he doesn't seem to mention that, and it certainly hasn't survived. And of course, there'd be his lock of hair on the reverse side. If we've got in the library a number of pieces of hair, we could DNA test them and reconstruct some of these people. It would be an interesting thing. Anyway, Flinders was born on the 16th of March 1774 in Lincolnshire, and he didn't enter the Navy till he was 16. This was fairly old to be entering the Navy. He usually entered at 12 or 13, because his father wanted him to be a doctor like he was, and so he worked as an apothecary for a short time. And he was 16 before he entered, and he was attached to Thomas Pasley through the fact that his cousin was a servant in Pasley's home. So he got attached to Pasley's. And why did he join the Navy? Well, he says he joined the Navy because he read Robinson Crusoe, and he certainly did read Robinson Crusoe throughout his life. But I like to think he joined the Navy because of this ambition again, because the Navy was a very peculiar institution in the 18th century in that it promoted on merit. Of course, you bought your commission in the army until well into the 19th century. But in the Navy, it promoted on merit. And there was a possibility for people who had no background to rise on ability. Well, of course, Cook would have been the outstanding example of that, a labourer's son. And but of course, later we'd have Nelson and Bligh himself. Bligh rose on ability, although there is the argument, of course, that Bligh got into a lot of trouble because he was not a gentleman. That was not born as a gentleman. And in New South Wales, the New South Wales Court rather resented the fact that he was not a gentleman. And in Jane Austen's Persuasion, there's a piece that sums up this point about the Navy. The old snob Sir Walter Elliot, who used to read the Baronetage every evening, he said he hated the Navy, and he said because it was the means of bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction and of raising men to honours which their fathers and grandfathers never dreamt of. And so this would appeal to Matthew Flinders. He doesn't have family background, doesn't have any money, but he has a very keen awareness of his abilities, and he might be able to make his name shine. Anyway, Pasley recommended him to go with Bligh on the Providence voyage, not the Bounty voyage, of course. That was the previous voyage, but Bligh did the thing all over again, which was to transfer the breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies. Now, in Bligh, of course, a lot of things have been said about Bligh, but no one, even his detractors, even his worst detractors, never said he was not a superb seaman and a wonderful sailor. And, of course, Matthew learnt under William Bligh for the 2 years that he was on Providence and sailed around the world, including visiting Tasmania, not realising that, of course, this part of the world was going to be very much his area of professional endeavour. And this is Bligh actually after the mutiny, before he goes on the Providence, when he's a great hero. And you can see the longboat in the distance, and this is the frontispiece to Bligh's account of that voyage. And so Bligh taught Flinders. Now, this would have been particularly significant to Flinders because Bligh had actually learned under Cook. And if you couldn't learn under Cook yourself, the next best thing was to learn under a man who had learned under Cook. It's the same principle. Danced with a man who's danced with a girl who's danced with the Prince of Wales. And so the same thing. So Flinders would have been, that would have been a very important point. And he did learn a lot from that voyage, obviously in the area of charting, and Bligh allowed him to do a few charts, nothing of any great significance. But you'll see in the margins of those charts, because Bligh signed the charts as only was probably, he was the captain, he was authorising it. There's a little MF in the margins, so that now even at this stage, Flinders is telling posterity he actually did these charts, he actually drew them. Anyway, he comes back from that voyage, and the Reliance in 1795 is coming out to Sydney, bringing Governor Hunter as governor. And so he asks to join that voyage in order to get his 6 years sea service. Now, in order to sit for the lieutenant's examination, you had to have 6 years at sea, not 6 years in the Navy, but actually 6 years at sea. So before he could even sit for that, which was the first rung really, he had to have been at sea for 6 years. And so this would be a good opportunity on the Reliance, coming all the way out to Sydney and all the way back, to do that. And so he got that gig. Some people say he was thinking of exploring at that stage, but I'm not so sure. I think it was experience and maybe a bit of seeing the world and getting his 6 years sea service. But the man he met on the voyage, George Bass, certainly was coming out to do some exploration. He said, I'm going to explore more than anyone else has. Poor old Bass. This is a reproduction of unfortunately a 19th century photograph of a painting which no longer exists. And we don't know where it is. It's the only image of Bass that does exist. But Bass was a surgeon on the Reliance, and he would be a great influence on Matthew Flinders. Bass was 3 years older than Flinders. Flinders was 21, Bass was 24. But Bass was everything Matthew Flinders wanted to be. First of all, Bass was a man of action, but he was also an intellectual, which appealed greatly to Flinders. Flinders was always interested in the head and the heart. He brought a library of books. Bass actually brought 90 books with him on that voyage. It's the first library here. And it included everything from classical poetry, classical writers up to modern poetry. Unfortunately, I don't know that we've ever been... we know what the books were, but we've never been able to locate the actual copies that were here. I don't know what's happened to them. But Bass was also entrepreneurial. He was multilingual. Well, of course, Flinders only spoke English. He was charismatic. There's no doubt about that. In fact, when the French were here in 1802, they were collecting natural history specimens to take back to the museum in Paris, and said he should go back and be in a glass case. Because he was so extraordinary. Extraordinary in every respect is a line that is used about Bass. And of course, Flinders was bowled over. He wrote a famous letter to Bass, although it's only been known, this letter, for about 10 years, when we bought it. There was a time when I was so completely wrapped up in you that no conversation but yours could give me any degree of pleasure. Your footsteps upon the quarterdeck over my head took me from my book and brought me upon deck to walk with you. How great is the service you have been of to me. My mind has often called you its Socrates. You have partly taught me to know my own good and bad qualities. From you I have learned to judge of mankind more accurately. And he was a huge influence. Flinders wanted to be like Bass. Bass had brought the tiny Tom Thumb with him, Tom Thumb boat on the Reliance. And Bass was going exploring, and so Matthew goes off too. And they arrive in Sydney in 1795. This is the letter. That's that letter I read. You see Matthew Flinders' rather florid signature there. He had a very good signature. Obviously realised he was going to be famous and had a very good signature. And there's Sydney at the time, almost exactly 1795. And together in the Tom Thumb, as you know, they went up the Georges River to the site of Bankstown, and then later on another little ship called the Tom Thumb. The next year they went as far as Port Kembla and discovered Lake Illawarra and charted that part of the coast. Or Flinders did the charting, Bass didn't do the charting. And then together they went on the Norfolk in 1798-99 around Tasmania. This was a great voyage to prove whether it was an island or not. And they did, of course, prove it to be an island. And Flinders created the first chart. And a little story I like about the first chart is that Port Dalrymple is the great stretch of water they discovered in northern Tasmania on which Launceston would later be founded. And it was, I think, it was partly because of Bass and Flinders' reports that settlement occurred there. And sometimes I've read, why would they call it Port Dalrymple? Why would they do that? And, I have one little theory for you. Alexander Dalrymple had just been appointed the first naval hydrographer back in England, and he was working out a publication program for all the manuscript maps they had. And so when this map went back to Britain, what would he see right in the middle of the map? Port Dalrymple. So maybe Flinders had a deft hand with the patron. I mean, he would have wouldn't have had the final say. He would have probably had to recommend the name. But I think it's interesting anyway. And this was a great achievement of Bass and Flinders to do this. Obviously, it made a huge difference to the time it took for ships to get to Sydney. They didn't have to go down around southern Tasmania. On that trip down to Tasmania in the Furneaux Islands, Bass actually did the first scientific description of the wombat. Bass was a scientist. He loved this sort of work. He into natural history. He wasn't a chart maker. And although the colony had existed for 10 years, no one had actually made a study of the wombat. And down in the Furneaux Islands, Bass did. And then when they get back, Bass now wants to go off and be a merchant. Bass was hyperactive. Bass could never settle to anything. Unlike Flinders, who once he decided what he was going to do, he settled. Bass, in fact, there's a lovely letter that Bass's mother writes to him. She says, "Dear, are you ever going to settle down?" Because he's up all over the place. But he wanted to be a merchant, and that was how he was going to make money. And I think he was such an influence on Flinders. At this stage, here is Flinders, just before he is going back to England on the Reliance. He thinks he might do that too. He might become a merchant. In fact, he wanted to go with Bass and work with Bass as a merchant. But reading between the lines, I think Bass was too sophisticated and Flinders too green. I don't think Bass really wanted Flinders with him as a merchant. So, and he writes this letter from Sydney just before he gets on the ship, which is to a friend from Bligh's Voyage, who's in the East Indies. And he says, "I'm tired of serving for a pittance, and as it were living from hand to mouth, whilst others with no better claim are making hundreds and thousands. The examples I have seen in this place have opened my eyes a little to my own interest." So he wants to make money. People are making hundreds and thousands here, and he wants to be able to do that too. There are people here making hundreds and thousands with no better claim than I have, and that's Sydney, isn't it? I must say, I always said that in my lectures on Flinders when I did the Flinders exhibition, and I always got a huge laugh for that line. But in other places other than Sydney, because I used to say, of course, that wouldn't be the case in cultured Adelaide or intellectual Melbourne, no. So he gets back to Britain now, but he's changed his mind, and we don't know why he's changed his mind. He doesn't want to be a merchant anymore. And he knows what he wants to be. He wants to finish the discovery of Australia. Now, it's wartime, every ship and man is needed, and here he wants to go back and see if he can really solve the riddle of whether the west coast of Australia and the north and the east coast is one landmass or not, having already shown that Tasmania is an island. So what does he do in order to get this voyage of a lifetime? Well, he does something which perhaps won't surprise you, but he writes to the great Sir Joseph Banks. I mean, here he is, a nothing, a 26-year-old nothing, a lieutenant by this stage, but still a 26-year-old nothing. And he writes to the great president of the Royal Society to ask, can he have this voyage? Well, here's Banks in his Wedgwood medallion, looking very suitably regal, but this is what he looked like actually at the time. So, but if Josiah Wedgwood is a personal friend of yours, there's no reason why you shouldn't have a medallion of yourself done. So he writes to the great Banks, and this is Banks also. This is Benjamin West. This is Banks at Flinders' age, when Banks had just come back from Cook's first voyage, on which, of course, he went berserk at Botany Bay, and also in Cooktown, and brought back all the loot. There you are. You see, he's in a flax cloak from New Zealand, and bits from Tahiti, and he's got this was a painting by Benjamin West. Because when Banks came back from that Cook's first voyage, it was really Banks's voyage people talked about, because it was all the loot he brought back, all the natural history. Banks was the hero of the hour. Banks had this great affection for New South Wales. So he writes to the great Joseph Banks, and he starts off by saying that he's done a few charts that Banks may have seen, and he thinks they're pretty good. He's not bashful. in this. He said, he thinks they're pretty good. And then he says, if His Majesty would like the discovery of New Holland completed, I'm your man. And then he finishes with one of his wonderful croffles. Now, this is another piece of flattery that he made. And he said, pleading in behalf of any informality there may be in thus addressing Banks, that almost constant employment abroad and an education amongst the unpolished inhabitants of the Lincolnshire Fens have prevented me from learning better, but not from imbibing the respect and consideration with which the Right Honourable President of the most learned society in the world will always be held by his most devoted and obedient servant. Really lays it on with a trowel. What happens? Well, nothing happens for 2 months. Flinders were probably on tenterhooks, was this going to achieve anything? Was Banks upset with him? And then after 2 months, a note came and asked Flinders to meet with Banks. The note came on a Sunday. We don't know when Flinders went around, but it would have been pretty quickly. But we do know that on the Friday, that is less than a week, the official order went out to prepare a ship. Flinders to be given an all-volunteer crew. He could choose his men. No riffraff. This in a time of war, when every ship was needed. Flinders had got the dream of a lifetime. Banks obviously just wanted to see the young man. He went around, he saw him, and it all fell into place because Banks had arranged it in the interim with his neighbour and friend George John, Lord Spencer. I don't think there are any documents at all relating to this. It would have been done in the good old 18th century way, just a little chat in the study. Much better, not to have a paper trail. It rather hampers ICAC's work, you see. So Spencer had authorised this, and consequently Spencer got a nice big gulf named after him. Of course, but the government changed. Just in the nick of time, Banks had organised this because the government changed and Spencer was out of office. And the new man, Banks didn't have such a good relationship with the new man, but the new man was John Jarvis, Earl St Vincent. He allowed the whole thing to continue, so he got the next sized gulf named after him. Incidentally, I just want to say here on my soapbox, he is John Jarvis. His name is pronounced Jarvis. He used to be known as Old Jarvie in the Navy. It is ridiculous when you hear the ABC speaking of Jervis Bay. It is ridiculous that the locals in Jervis Bay call it Jervis Bay. Absolutely ridiculous, and you must correct them when they speak. It is Jarvis, John Jarvis. Really and truly. Anyway, 1801, the whole expedition, of course, was under Banks's survey. Banks had a very big hand in it. At one point, Banks writes to the Navy office and says, "Has my proposal been approved?" And the memo comes back, "Any proposal by you, Sir Joseph, will be approved." And during this period, Matthew Flinders publishes a book called Observations on the Coast of Van Diemen's Land, which includes his big map of Tasmania. And, of course, he shows it to Banks in proof. And Banks sends back a trifling correction, or not even a correction, but a trifling comment. And, of course, Flinders lays it on again. "Your letters, Sir Joseph, I always receive with pleasure, and consider each one as a fresh honour conferred upon me." I always longed when I was working to write to my boss and say, "I always regard your memo as a pleasure and consider each one as a fresh honour conferred upon me." Banks, of course, had his artists and his natural history people on board. Interestingly, Flinders was paid £250 a year to be in overall charge of the expedition, in charge of all the crew, and of course in total charge of where they went and the survey. Robert Brown, who was the botanist, although there's Flinders in his hat, in his commander's hat as he was to set out on the voyage, and of course his sword. Robert Brown, this is unfortunately an older photograph of Robert Brown. He became quite an eminent botanist. He was on the voyage, he was paid £420. The artist, Ferdinand Bauer, was paid £350, which was pretty good because Ferdinand Bauer was one of the top-notch, some say the best natural history artist in the world. But William Westall, who was only 19 and was the landscape artist, was also paid £350. So Flinders these scientists and artists were paid considerably more than Flinders was to run the whole show. So he sets out on the 18th of July 1801, 88 men and 2 cats, one of which is the famous Trip. And he keeps a meticulous logbook, of course. This is Keppel Bay, August 1802. This is what the logbook looks like. And in keeping with Flinders' intellectual aspirations, while he's circumnavigating Australia and charting it, he's reading Paradise Lost, which is what Philip Parker King also did when he was charting parts of Australia, and this is the copy of Philip Parker King's. So he starts off at Cape Leeuwin, comes out across the Indian Ocean, starts off at Cape Leeuwin, reaches Cape Leeuwin in December 1801, and starts to chart the great expanse of water known as King George Sound. Now, he'd been told, don't worry about that, because you can do that later if you like, but move on to what was really the Great Australian Bight and chart that, because that's the unknown coast. Because it was known that Nicolas Bourdin, the Frenchman, was in the area doing the same thing. And any delay, Bourdin might be first to chart the unknown south coast. But you see, Flinders couldn't help himself. He couldn't help himself just spending a little more time. As it was, Bourdin had his own problems because he was down in Tasmania and his artists and scientists wanted to stay longer in Tasmania, and that delayed him. Otherwise, he would have charted the unknown south coast first. In fact, Freycinet, who was on the Bourdin expedition, says to Flinders, tell the way he says it, what he thought of this. He said, well, you wouldn't have been the first to chart the unknown south coast if we hadn't been picking up shells and catching butterflies in that demon's land. So it moves along then. He comes to St Vincent's Gulf, Spencer Gulf, big stretch of water. This might be a great channel that goes through. Same with St Vincent's Gulf. This may be a big channel. And of course, to some extent with Port Phillip, this may be a big area. But of course, Spencer and St Vincent Gulf end in swamps, and, well, Port Phillip ends in Melbourne, so you see, they're all disappointed. Just after Kangaroo Island, Nicolas Bourdin appears on his ship, coming from the other direction, and but all the work being done by Flinders. So Flinders gets the honour of charting the unknown south coast. The Bourdin expedition also had their artists, and they did these wonderful drawings of the Tasmanian Aborigines. Particularly important because the French drew what they saw, whereas the British tended to make the Aboriginal people noble savages and didn't, to fit in with a view. But this is one, and then the scarification there, these are very valuable, and of course the canoes, and very valuable collection. Anyway, they all end up in Sydney, and he's Bennelong Point, and those rather elegant, chic tents are, you won't be surprised, the French tents there on Bennelong Point. So Bourdin and Flinders were in port for a while. They entertained each other, although the Bourdin ship was so racked with scurvy that they could barely get in to Port Jackson, and Flinders' men had to help the ship get in. Now, so Flinders now has some months in Sydney in which he repairs the ship. Philip Gidley King, the governor, and his wife Anna Josepha entertain them. And King says, now go straight up to the Gulf of Carpentaria, because that's what needs to be done now. And this is July. Make sure you go straight up there now, avoiding the monsoon season. So you'll get the charting over before the monsoon. So Flinders leaves Sydney, and this is William Westall's view of Sydney at that time. He was the artist on board. And they also take on board Bungaree, the Aboriginal person, to help them interpret and speak to the Aborigines as they sailed around Australia. But unfortunately, Bungaree soon realised himself, when they didn't get very much further up the coast, that he couldn't understand what the Aboriginal people were saying anyway. So he did exactly what we sometimes tend to do. We just shout at them and speak louder. So, but did Flinders follow those orders? No, of course not. Because if he couldn't sail past King George Sound, which had been done by Vancouver, he's certainly not going to sail past the great east coast done by Cook, is he? He's not going to sail right past that. And of course he does, delaying all the time. And he knows that he's delaying, and he knows that the monsoon season is going to be upon him, but he can't help himself. And of course he discovers things that Cook didn't, because Cook was a broad brush man, and he wasn't detailed like Flinders. That wasn't his role. And when he does that, he puts in his journal, discovered so-and-so, which was missed by the great Captain Cook in his hasty trip up the east coast. So he finds Port Curtis, for example, which is was a big discovery where Gladstone is, and he charts and names the Great Barrier Reef. And he's the first person to say this will be one of the great scientific wonders of the world. His chart of the Great Barrier Reef would last until it was superseded by aerial photography. That's how good it was. And on the way up, of course, he has his artists, Ferdinand Bauer, doing these wonderful, it's a Banksy, of course, doing these wonderful paintings of plants, some of the finest ever done. Just wonderful. Of course, that's the Guinea lily, which Bass was the first to describe. Now, he gets up to the Gulf of Carpentaria, and of course, it's the wrong season of the year. It is now November, the worst possible time. Luckily, there is no monsoon. He said we would have been crushed like an egg if there had been. And he starts this great survey of the Gulf of Carpentaria. I think really it's his finest work. It lasted until 1964, when it was replaced by the Royal Australian Navy's charting. A wonderful piece of work to chart this huge gulf. And off Arnhem Land, he sees these vessels coming. These are Macassans. And Flinders is the first person to record, or the only evidence to record, that these Macassans had been visiting the Northern Australia for perhaps 100 years, and some of them intermarried with the Aboriginal people. And in the north there, in Darwin, for example, I think they've got trees and things that they mark. These came with the Macassans. And Flinders records that in his journal. Quite fortuitously, he'd taken on a cook in Sydney who was an Arab, and so he could actually speak to these Macassans. During the Gulf, he realises that the ship's rotten, and he just has enough time to finish the Gulf, and then he'll have to go back home by the west coast, but won't be able to chart it, as was done substantially by the Dutch. But he wanted, of course, to rechart it. They go to Timor just to replenish themselves, where, of course, as often happened in Timor, a lot of the men get ill with dysentery. And so they're sailing down the west coast and then along the south coast. And Flinders can't help just fixing up some little things on the south coast. And at that point, the surgeon on the ship says, you can't do this. You've got to get back to Sydney quickly. Get these men to help in Sydney. And Flinders said, you are the surgeon. You only have one job, and that is to keep these men healthy. I'm the captain. I have many jobs. If my only job was to keep these men healthy, I would never have let them leave England and have subjected them to shipwreck and tropical diseases. So they finally get back to Sydney, and he writes to Banks, I'm a young man just commencing my career, and I've done this marvellous work, and my charts will be wonderful, and I've shown it to be one continent. But of course, his career was now over. Because in his haste to get back to England to get another ship, He went on a very leaky vessel called the Cumberland, which he knew was leaky, he knew it was unseaworthy, but he couldn't resist it, he couldn't help himself, he wanted to get back to England quickly to get another ship. He had to pull into Mauritius because the ship was so unseaworthy. And there, of course, he would be placed under house arrest for 6.5 years. He'd be there. Once again, Flinders could have got out of it, could have used his charm, could have used his flattery with the French governor. Oh no, because Flinders was the professional, and this was such an aspersion on his professional character to accuse him of being a spy. He kept his hat on while he was talking to the French general, which infuriated the French general. He was invited to dinner with the French governor and his wife, and he said no. And then while he's on the island, he writes letters to everybody saying this is a dreadful example of injustice, the greatest ever in the history of the human race, was one line. And he talks about Charles de Conde, the French governor, as a Robespierre, a tyrant, an illiberal person, even though he knew, it's like he knew about the monsoon, even though he knew that those letters were being vetted before they left the island. And even Joseph Banks wrote to him and said, tone it down. How can you expect to get off the island when you're saying all these things about the French governor? And he said, no, when I have been treated the way I have been, I can act in no other way. So you see, he was his own nemesis in many ways. High professional standards brought him down when they were questioned. He couldn't bear his professionalism being questioned. And he was a representative of His Majesty's Navy, 6.5 years. And of course, so he's separated from his wife for much longer than he thought he would be, and separated in the end for 9 years. But he's a great letter writer, and luckily we do have some of his letters that were sent, but he drafted all his letters in a letter book, even his love letters to his wife. This is to Anne, and you can see all the crossings out there. And he actually signs it even in the letter book, Matthew Flinders. And so we often have the draft, which is really better because it shows his first thoughts as well as his second thoughts. And, you know, he was very particular about grammar. And he believed he hadn't been educated well. But he had actually. He was pretty good. I mean, he went to school till he was 14 or 15, which wasn't too bad. Went to grammar school, but he had this idea, and then he was concerned that others of his family ought to be educated. And quite interestingly, even his sisters, he believed his sisters should be educated. And he said, nothing can make up for lack of education, he said. He had a great respect for learning and an intellectual, as I said. Anyway, he gets home, finally. He's never going to get another ship. Time has passed him by. I mean, we're now 1810, we're at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, and he's given the task of simply publishing his charts and writing the account of his voyage, which he does. And this is the draft preface to that wonderful book, which was published as A Voyage to Terra Australis. So from late 1810, he gets back to Britain until he dies, really, in July 1814. He's working on his charts and writing the account of his voyage. And as I said, this will be published on the 18th of July, and he dies the next day. So he never got the fame in his lifetime. Gets it now. He never got the fame in his lifetime. He never got the money either. He wasn't a post captain long enough for his wife to get much of a pension. And consequently, his wife lived for almost 50 years in poverty. Keeping his memory alive, you see this little box of goodies she has, plucked from the grave. This was hair that was taken from the grave. And so she said at one stage, I suppose I'm partial, she said, but he was just the greatest man that ever lived. So someone said to me, it was a perfect marriage. He was away most of the time. That's why she could make that comment. Anyway, she kept him very much in her thoughts. And eventually, it was, I can see Christine getting a bit restive there. Eventually, it was decided that New South Wales government and the Victorian government decided they should do something for poor old Mrs. Flinders, the widow, because Flinders had done so much for Australia. So they voted her a pension of £300 a year, which was quite an enormous amount of money. But unfortunately, by the time that got into the system, she had died. However, they said it would go to her daughter, Matthew and Anne's only daughter, only child. And so she used that money to educate her son, Matthew Flinders' grandson, who became a famous Egyptologist, Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie. And in the 20th century, Petrie gave the Matthew Flinders papers, all the diaries, letters, etc., to the library across the road, on the condition that a statue be erected to his grandfather, which is there today. And that's why the Matthew Flinders statue is there, to get those papers. I always find it fascinating, in those days it must have been so much easier to do things. It would be impossible now, almost impossible, if a donor said, I will give you something if you erect a statue. But the chief librarian at the time, Ifold, was a great collector. This didn't faze him at all. Of course we'll erect a statue. And, but of course the library couldn't pay for a statue because it didn't have money to do that. It could only pay for manuscripts. So he just says to the government, you erect the statue and then the papers will come to you and we'll pay you for how much it cost, pay you for the papers how much it cost the statue. And it's all done like this. I mean, can you imagine the fuss today? It would go on forever. Even though the government was paying, Ifold told them where the statue was going to be. And what's more, that the library would own it. And so, but it was just done. It was amazing. It was so easy. I mean, it'd go on for years now, just years. And there'd be commissions of inquiry and occupational health and safety things. And there'd be, really and truly, I mean, it would just go on forever. And however, the lovely statue of Macquarie at the head of Macquarie Street is on a plinth, which I think ridiculous. Macquarie should be on the ground, as he was very much a man of the people, where you could stand by him. Now, I think it was actually reported in the paper that both the Premier and the Governor wanted it on the ground. But the bureaucrats said there was some reason why it had to be on a plinth. I don't know what that would be. Someone would kick it or something, or who knows. So thank heavens we got the Flinders statue at the right time. Anyway, thank you.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. You've brought him to life, a real person. That's not just a name. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
You said that Macquarie used the name Australia officially. Now, there may not, the meanings of the words official and formal may overlap. However, I was under the impression that Macquarie's use of the word made it formal, and that the Navy's use of the word in the mid-1820s made it official.
Well, that's probably right. Philip Parker King's charts used it. It used Australia without any terror Australis. So you might be right, formal and official, yeah. I stand corrected by a more learned gentleman. Yes?
What did Matthew Flinders die from and how long was he?
He was 40 when he died, and he died of an infection in the kidneys, which would be easily treated today with antibiotics, and he wouldn't die. But he died in some agony over some months.
In the Gulf of Carpentaria, you mentioned the word Corinth. Where did these people come from?
The Macassans. Macassans, yeah. They came from Makassar, which is near Malaysia. Yeah. Macassans, yeah. Yes.
Concerning Jervis,
yes.
There are other people who have that surname. Like in the 1930s, there was an eminent member of the society here, James Jarvis.
Yes.
Are there any places where Jarvis is the correct pronunciation? Oh, sorry. Are there any instances where Jervis is the correct pronunciation?
I don't know. I don't know how James Jarvis Jervis pronounced his name. But all I know is that Jarvis, our Jarvis, Earl St Vincent, was pronounced Jarvis.
With Sir Joseph Banks supporting the expedition, there was obviously some self-interest in that he was expecting to get, I assume, samples of things back.
Oh yes, yes, and that's why he had his artists on board. And
Do you think that there was similar self-interest when Banks was such a strong supporter of the idea of a colony in New South Wales? Do you think that was behind his support?
what, his own self-interest?
Yes.
No, I don't think so. I mean, he was interested in the empire and he was interested in the transfer of goods around the empire. His support of New South Wales, I think, was just purely that he thought it would be a good place for a colony, and also of strategic importance. That may have been in his mind too. I don't think so much self-interest though.
Please do join me again in thanking Paul for a fantastic